Hey everyone, welcome back to the Melek'le Yemek channel. Today we're opening up a cheese we made back in 2023, and it's one that many of you have been asking me to share for years now. I tried it a few times before, but it never really worked out. This time it turned out perfectly. Today's recipe, my dear friends, is for homemade Gruyère cheese. As you can see, I've got 20 liters of raw milk that I bought fresh from the dairy. First things first, we need to strain the milk really well. Our milkman already strains it once, but tiny little bits still remain, so I like to strain it again using a cheesecloth like this. It really helps get it extra clean. After straining, I place the milk on the stove. Since it's winter, I'm going to ferment it at 34 degrees Celsius. Normally anywhere between 32 and 37 degrees Celsius works, but in winter it's better to go a bit warmer so the rennet activates properly. Like I said, we're making Gruyère cheese using natural rennet, specifically şirden mayası, which comes from the lining of a calf's stomach. It's important to always have a thermometer on hand. And to be honest, if you're trying Gruyère, you probably already have one. You also need a proper environment for cheese making at home, my friends. I keep stirring gently, and the moment it reaches exactly 34 degrees Celsius, I take it off the heat. And now it's at a full 34.1 degrees Celsius. Perfect. So I add in 1 glass of natural rennet. I actually made this rennet myself, and there are multiple videos on my channel showing how to make your own at home. Just search homemade natural rennet or how to make cheese rennet at home. I highly recommend it, especially if you want to make clean, natural food with no chemicals. Now that we've added the rennet, I wrap the pot in a blanket to keep it warm. It is winter after all. I leave it to ferment for 1 hour. If it were summer, 40 minutes would be enough, and you wouldn't even need to cover it. Alright, let's check on it. Let's open it together in the final 5 seconds and see if it worked. Yes, it worked. To check if your cheese is set properly, gently press your hand on top. If it jiggles like jelly and doesn't stick to your hand, it's good. Another way to check, insert a knife into the center. If it comes out clean like this, your cheese has set. And if it hasn't set, don't worry, just wrap it up again and let it sit for another 30 minutes to an hour. No need to panic or rush. Sometimes cheese just takes its time to wake up. Now that it's set, I'm going to cut it using a spatula. You can use a big knife if you prefer, or even a proper cheese cutter if you have one. Once it's cut, I start breaking it down into tiny rice-sized pieces. That's super important for this step. We want to get them nice and fine. Since I'm working with 20 liters of milk, the pot is big enough to handle the next step comfortably. This is where we move into the second cooking stage. Gruyère is a multi-step cheese that takes time and patience. Now I scoop out about half a bucket of whey and set it aside. Then I turn the stove back on and start cooking the cheese again, this time up to 60 degrees Celsius, stirring gently the whole way. In the first stage, we heated the raw milk to 34 degrees Celsius to ferment it and let it set. Now in the second stage, we want the cheese curds to sink to the bottom and start to bind together. As they do, the whey rises to the top, and I scoop some of that out from time to time to help the cooking go faster and make it easier to reach the curds with my hands. If you want, you can use a whisk during this step, but I prefer using my hands. When I cook or make something like this, I always like to use my hands. It helps me really feel the texture and understand exactly what stage it's at. I keep checking the temperature carefully with a thermometer, making sure it stays right at 60 degrees Celsius, not above or below. And make sure the flame is set to medium, not too high or too low. If it's too hot, your cheese will cook too quickly, and that's not what we want. This stage needs to be slow and steady so that all the whey inside the curds gets released properly. That's the key, my friends. Stir it gently with your hands, a slotted spoon, or a whisk, whatever you're comfortable with, but don't let the curds just sit there or they'll stick to the bottom of the pot. This is raw milk, so it starts melting fast, but we don't want the cheese to melt. We want the raw whey inside the curds to drain out completely. If, when you squeeze the curds, they hold their shape like a lentil meatball, that means they've reached the right consistency. That's your signal that you've hit 60 degrees Celsius and it's time to take the cheese off the heat and move on to draining. Now that we're right at 60 degrees Celsius, I take the pot off the heat and move on to the draining process. Before I actually strain the cheese, I remove the leftover whey at the bottom and set it aside. Don't throw it away. If you've been following my channel for a while, you know we don't waste anything in this kitchen. We repurpose everything. And with this whey, I always recommend boiling it and using it to make Lore cheese first. Then you can use it for other things. Now we're placing the cheese into a cheesecloth and straining it thoroughly. I don't actually have professional cheese molds at home, so I create my own using regular kitchen tools. Of course, you can buy special cheese molds if you want, but if not, feel free to get creative like I do. For example, to give this Gruyère a nice round wheel-like shape, I used a sponge cake mold. I also placed a metal strainer at the bottom to help with drainage. I gently press it down with my hands to help release more of the moisture. Since our cheese has already been cooked, it lets go of that extra liquid pretty easily. Now I'm using a large cake mold along with a springform ring. If you've got one of these, it makes shaping the cheese super easy. If not, you can try using heat-resistant containers, though I don't usually recommend plastic. There are some plastics that can handle 180 degrees Celsius or even 360 degrees Celsius. You can use those if metal isn't available. I give it a gentle press to help it hold its shape and prevent the curds from separating. This step has to be done quickly while the cheese is still warm and steamy, that way the curds stick together more easily. As you can see, I'm pressing from the top to help it hold that nice shape. From here on, we're going to move more slowly and carefully, shaping this cheese into a proper wheel of Gruyère. I also keep checking the cheesecloth every now and then. Sometimes it folds in weird ways, and the cheese can get trapped in those folds, which causes it to dry unevenly or form cracks. Since I've made this cheese a few times, I've learned to stay on top of that. About 30 minutes later, while the cheese is still warm, I flip it over to shape the other side and prevent cracking. I use a fresh cheesecloth soaked in whey, then carefully flip the cheese. The bottom had taken on a nice round shape, like a cylinder, but the top still looked uneven. Flipping helps ensure both the top and bottom come out smooth and uniform. The previous cheesecloth I used was a bit too large, so it didn't give me the tight shape I wanted. As the cheese gets smaller, I switch to smaller cloths for a snugger fit. This time I make sure to fold the cheesecloth properly. If it's bunched up, the pressure from the weight on top will cause the cheese to form unevenly, so I keep checking and adjusting as needed. If you're making a larger batch, you'd normally let it sit longer in the mold, around a full day. I let it sit in the springform mold, but every 2 to 3 hours I come back to flip it over so it shapes evenly on all sides. Don't just leave it as is. This step is super important if you want a smooth, well-formed wheel. To drain out the remaining whey and help the cheese hold its shape, I placed it on the bottom of a kunefe pan, and then I used paving stones as weights. Yep, paving stones. Every 2 to 3 hours, I came back, flipped the cheese, and let it sit like that for a full day. Now that it's had time to sit, I've removed it from the mold, and as you can see, it started drying out nicely. The longer it sits, the more the shape and texture improve naturally over time. Next, I remove it from the springform mold and begin the dry salting process, which lasts 4 to 5 days. I keep the cheese at room temperature during this step, again around 5 days in total. The cheese sat in the mold for 1 day, getting flipped every few hours. As time passed, you'll notice the cheese developed a nice yellow tint, thanks to its fat content. Now it's time for dry salting. I'm not using a mold for the dry salting stage, but you'll see in a moment that the humidity in my city is fairly low and it gets pretty cold and dry here. When I made this cheese, it was winter and the air was chilly. Because of that, I noticed a slight bulging at the top of the cheese, a sign that fermentation was speeding up a bit too much. So I took a long skewer and poked a hole at the bottom of the cheese to let the air escape and prevent it from cracking. In previous tries, the cold and dry conditions had caused the cheese to dry out too fast and split along the edges. To help regulate things this time, I wet another cheesecloth, salted it, and laid it over the top of the cheese. Thanks to that, we got through all 5 days of dry salting with no cracks at all. After those 5 days, it's time for the cheese to rest in brine, a saltwater solution, for 15 days. For the brine, I use 3 liters of water and the salt content should be 30% of the water weight. So for 3 liters, I'm adding 900 grams of salt. You'll need to measure this based on how much cheese you have, but the key is this: the brine should contain 30% salt. I'm using ground rock salt, that's what I recommend. Now, depending on how much cheese you're making, adjust the amount of brine accordingly. The formula is simple: 30% salt by weight in the brine. After I add the cheese to this solution, I'll store it in the fridge for 15 days. The fridge is a little warmer than ideal, but we make it work. Normally, cheese like this is kept at 8 to 13 degrees Celsius, but even if your fridge runs a bit warmer, just be consistent. And that's it for now. Once the 15 days are up, I'll be back to show you what happens next. So now I'm adjusting the salt. I've measured out exactly 900 grams. To prevent the salt from sinking straight to the bottom of the pot, I dissolved a little of it first. As you can see, it's quite a bit, almost a whole kilo of salt. If I poured it in all at once, it would just fall to the bottom and dissolve slowly, meaning the salt wouldn't reach the cheese properly right away. That could cause the cheese to soften or even start melting slightly, and we don't want that. Remember, we let this cheese sit in the mold for 1 full day and then dry salted it for 5 days, so now we're at day 6. At this stage, the cheese is already starting to firm up and take shape. This salted brine will help firm up the outside even more while keeping the inside nice and soft. That's exactly what we want. Now I'm adding the salt to the brine and placing the cheese into it. To keep the cheese fully submerged, I place a plate on top inside the pot. Otherwise, it tends to float to the surface. Then I just pop the lid on. After 15 days, as you can see, the inside of the pot is covered with salty residue and the cheese has taken on a beautiful shape. The brine has turned a bit greenish, like classic whey water, which is exactly what we expect. Now we remove the cheese and begin the final dry aging stage. I keep it in a room that stays around 30 to 32 degrees Celsius with about 90% humidity. That's the ideal environment for this phase. I continue this dry aging step for about 10 to 15 days. Personally, I aged this one for 15 days. During that time, I flip the cheese every 5 days. Each time I flip it, I clean off the old salt from the surface, wipe both sides, and apply a fresh layer of salt. You'll notice the cheese starts to sweat and soften slightly. That's totally normal. The salt dissolves a bit due to the warmth and humidity. Again, the humidity in my area is on the lower side. It stays around 60 to 70% and sometimes even drops to 58%, so I don't get the perfect conditions for traditional Gruyère. Still, we ended up with a soft, delicious, homemade Gruyère-style cheese, and I'm very happy with it. We made this cheese on January 28th, 2023, so it's been exactly 7 months since we started. Now I'm finishing up the final round of dry salting, cleaning off any remaining salt, and that's it. It's completely done. As you can see, the cheese is starting to sweat all over. It's absorbed the salt beautifully and it's holding its shape firmly. The top, bottom and sides have turned a nice yellow golden color. From here on out, I'm completely done with the salting phase. I'll leave the cheese to rest on wooden boards just like this. No more salt. It's clean and we're letting it rest as it is. Now after 7 full months, let's cut into our cheese together. It's been sitting this whole time. No salt, no brine, just aging naturally. You can cover it with a net if you'd like while it rests. Cutting it is actually pretty tough.
1 hour later.
My knife isn't dull. The cheese is just really firm. It's not easy to slice through even with a sharp blade. If I hadn't poked small holes in the top and bottom of the cheese earlier, the air bubbles inside would have been bigger and the texture a bit softer. But like I mentioned, I made those holes to prevent cracks and bursting during the early stages, so this texture is exactly what I expected. Still, it turned out amazing. Seriously, it's so flavorful. And despite all the salting we did, the salt level is quite mild. Not too strong at all. Definitely not an overly salty cheese. You can actually enjoy eating it and the flavor is fantastic. Even with my sharp knives, cutting through it takes real effort. It's that dense and firm. Thank you so much for watching. I know a lot of you have been asking for a Gruyère recipe for a long time. I hope you get a chance to try it at home and that your version turns out even better than mine. Thanks again for tuning in. I'll see you in the next recipe. Take care and bye for now.